Hello, you're with Property Mythbusters. Hi, I'm Ken from Avvora Finance broker.
I'm Deb from Crave Property Advisory.
And I'm Gilmovich from Real Property Manager.
And so we're here to bust the myths around the contradictions and misleading information in the property investing space. And for the next 10 minutes, we'll be discussing Labor's proposed policies will help housing affordability. So some of the proposed changes are to negative gearing and capital gains tax. John,
So this is a hot topic, and certainly has been a political football discussed as we lead up to a federal election. And so the proposal is to curb the current negative gearing regime. And to curb the capital gains tax paid by investors. So the proposal from Labor is to, from their angle, is to dampen the property market so that the first home buyer does a comeback, and that housing becomes more affordable. And is not longer out of reach of the average Australian. So before we go into the policy, Debra, just to explain to our audience, what is negative gearing?
So negative gearing, particularly relating to property, is when expenses exceed profits, creating a loss. And then the loss is offset against income, and that can be, in some cases, a tax benefit and can be packaged up as being attractive to some investors, often wrongly, but let's not go there. And so do you want to talk a little bit about what Labor's changes are?
Yeah, so the current benefits in relation to negative gearing is that it applies to all investment classes, both new property and the established.
And even shares.
And shares as well, if you have a share portfolio. The proposal from Labor is to segregate that and make it apply to new properties only. And on the capital gains tax, it's to reduce the current 50% discount benefit down to 25%. And for those to work with new build properties only.
And so with those changes, from your perspective, what do you believe the rollout impact will be?
Yeah, so when you have such a policy being discussed, and if it goes through, will be the big question. You have a market where you have two asset classes. So you've got the new builds and you've got the established properties. The established properties will only be grandfathers to those who are already receiving the benefits. But moving forward from a timeline when the policy is enacted, or if the policy is enacted, that will only apply to one class of property. So if there's one class of property that's going to be favoured, I can see some issues arising out of that. Firstly, the obvious one to me is that there's a concentration of both property investors and home buyers going for a particular class of property, which is new build. So you can only imagine, and you can just see...
that was the point I was going to cover.
The interest that it's going to drive. So you want to dwell a little bit more on that?
So from my perspective, because we're advising people on what to buy, so we see that creating this new class will entice wrongly unsuspecting investors into wanting new property only because they think they're getting the tax benefits. So that will drive prices up, and that will push effectively first home buyers out, because new property is attractive to first home buyers because they get the grants and stamp duty concessions and all of that kind of thing. So effectively, even though Labor says that they're introducing this change to actually help first home buyers, it'll have the exact opposite effect, as we were saying a few weeks ago, similar to the NRAS saga.
Yeah, so all of a sudden we can see that there may be another surge.
Yeah.
We know factually that, and there's data around this already, that construction and new starts for new builds has been in decline.
Yeah.
You can almost see the curve going back up again because there's this class of properties that now favours both investors and home buyers. All of a sudden they're competing for that stock and that stock only, driving the price up.
That's right.
Because there's
And
demand.
so we'll see all these developers going further and further, all the way out to Alice Springs, and so like what are our cities going to like just creep out even further because nobody wants to buy existing stock anymore because
it doesn't tick all the boxes for some. Because let's face it, over the years, it has been used as a tool for tax minimisation.
That's right.
Not tax avoidance, but let's be clear on that.
Yeah.
But it has been a tool for tax minimisation that's been used by accountants and financial planners as a vehicle that's there. It's legal. It's not illegal. It's legal.
Yeah.
And it did and has favoured the upper end high income earners.
Yeah. And so what do you see the impacts are from a finance perspective?
Yeah, from a finance perspective,
Yeah.
sure. So, look, I mean, it's yet to play itself out. In the recent, months and maybe a year or so, there's been a lot of uncertainty in playing around in our space. So this is just another one added to the long string of events which are ongoing. But I think borrowing capacity probably is going to be one of the bigger ones that is affected because some lenders do take into consideration negative gearing, and if that's taken off the table, that certainly does reduce borrowing capacity. So that could have an interesting income, regardless of whether it's an investor or a home buyer. And the other thing as well is probably to do with valuations. So if, generally speaking, the lenders are a little reactive in terms of what happens and kind of keep their ear to the ground on what's happening in the property space. But yeah, certainly if there's a division between two different types of properties, one being new and the other one being old, and they see that there's a significant risk in lending to new property, it can impact valuations. And even then, apart from impacting valuations, there are certain credit policies such as the LVR, loan to value ratio, which they can adjust specific to units or new buildings, and that can affect home loans and the choice of property that people can purchase.
So the current big four banks, just say right now, are seeing new build off the plan, especially off the plan property, especially apartments, as a high risk or a riskier proposition. So if an investment is a riskier proposition, then they will require more skin in the game.
Yeah, so that's one way that they can do that by increasing the requirements of the deposit or the funds that the buyer contributes, and that's affected through the LVR lenders loan to value ratio. So they reduced that quite some time ago. One of the major banks reduced the LVRs for Chatswood, and that was an interesting move by them. But they could have been overcapitalized or have too much risk exposure, concentration risk. So definitely they can increase the requirements specific, or they can kind of create new policies. I mean, that's not outside the question either. If they feel like, it'll.
And so to an investor, the key with property is the power of leverage. All of a sudden, the leverage ratio has been skewed, where someone else's money is no longer really working for them that hard any longer because of the leveraging situation. And obviously for a first home buyer, having to raise more deposit is even a challenge, or become an even bigger challenge.
Yeah, like for new home buyers,
Yeah.
generally speaking, when speaking to them, it's the deposit size, which is probably the biggest thing. I mean, income does kind of increase as they progress in their careers and things like that. So, you know, that kind of looks after itself, but the deposit size is generally the bigger item for most first home buyers. And if there's an increase in that, that'll definitely.
And do you think that we might see a change in the actual lending landscape? So different players come into it?
Yeah, so sometimes the different tiers, so the second tier lenders, mutual banks and credit unions and things like that might enter that space. I'm just thinking it depends on how things play out, because they are starting to get a bigger share of the market, and ASIC and the regulators are starting to look to some of the non-ADI lenders and tightening and getting visibility, and APRA has been given specific powers to make changes for those players in that space. So that, I mean, they could go for it, definitely, and then from there we could see changes, but definitely, some of the small lenders.
And it's possible that these two words we haven't heard for a long time, vendor finance, could make its way back to because the tier ones and possibly some of the tier twos will just look at it from a risk perspective and say no. You know, we can lend, but you're going to have to put more in, put more into the deal, and that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so what about from a rental perspective? What do you believe will happen with rents?
Well, that's interesting. Without it, I mean, this policy is being discussed, but bear in mind that this policy was being discussed about 2 years ago, when the market was completely different.
Yeah.
And it kind of made sense back then, not fully, but it kind of did, as a way to curb the hot activity that's been going on for the last 7 or 8 years, especially in our inner markets. Without this policy being enacted, the market is simply correcting itself already.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a downward pressure on rents, and we're seeing a downward pressure on property values.
Particularly in Sydney and Melbourne.
In Sydney and Melbourne. Yeah. The two biggest markets. So the train of thought is, well, the market's already naturally correcting itself, and there are certain things that have already occurred last year and a half with lending policy, with the Bank Royal Commission, with, I think, supply and demand. So it comes back to, okay, will this new class property that's going to be put on a pedestal be of great demand? Will the property investors come back if this makes sense? And do they see a future in off the plan new build property? So
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
I don't think it'll be really experienced investors that'll get taken by this change.
Yeah.
What I'm more concerned about is your first-time investor who'll just get caught up in that really hard-selling hype from like the spruikers or the marketers, and they'll just believe what they're told, and so we'll have that destabilising impact of putting more first-time investors who are very sensitive to any changes. It'll put more people into that kind of class, and it'll mean that that area is more unstable, because the minute interest rates increase, they'll have to sell, and so that puts them more at risk. And then the poor first home buyers who might have bought there, they've already paid too much because there's new investors going into that space, and so the whole thing will collapse. While the experienced investors will go, and these are the ones that Bill says he's trying to target, the ones with hundreds of properties, they'll be standing there going, I'll just scoop those up, thanks. It just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, you're making this that point about
so it's back to, I guess it's back to the supply and demand. So it can go either way. go either way. Like rents are starting to reduce in southern capital city because of oversupply. So we're seeing first time in years reductions of 5, 10, 15% in some Sydney metro areas. Same thing's happening with some suburbs interstate in Melbourne as well. So the question is, moving forward, will there be more demand for this type of stock? Will construction and building recommence and reignite, building more stock? And what sort of further pressure is that going to add on both rents and property values if the market says, well, no.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm not investing in this class any longer.
And as you were saying earlier, that because the first home buyers, because rents might have come down because there's more stock, and what was that point about the first home buyers would start to buy their own properties anyway, so there's less renters?
That's correct. So you can see a portion of the market that are currently renters, if they're given a chance to become home buyers, they'll take it. Yeah. So they'll stop being renters. Which potentially means that you can have more stock available for rent, and that's
putting more downward pressure.
Downward pressure. So you've got this issue of shortfalling. If there's more pressure on rents in the downward spiral, then there's going to be a shortfall in serviceability to the property investor. Again, doing the maths, you would think twice about going into such a stock property if it's not getting the yield. The yield is around on average around 3.5%.
Yeah. So
it's pretty low.
My view is that this proposed change will cause more financial hardship, and then someone else will have to come in, change the policy, and fix it back up again. Yeah. That's probably.
So where I can see Bill coming from is, okay, so we'll do away with the tax incentive schemes for property to save us money and bring it back to the coffers for the government to pay for services, schools, roads, health and so forth. However, they're detracting what is ultimately the self-funded retiree, disincentivise building their own wealth and not relying on the government.
That's right. Yeah, that was.
So it's almost counterproductive. Yeah. It's a counterproductive policy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so.
Well, that's our thoughts.
Yeah. So, is there anything else anyone would like to add?
Cool.
So thanks very much for watching. We'd love your feedback. So please join the Property Mythbusters Facebook group to send us questions or myths you would like busted. You can also contact us directly through our social media channels. So thanks for watching. Bye.
Take care.